This is Environmental Psychology, Unit 5, Part 2. So after World War II, you find that there was strong economic and population growth that was occurring. You've heard of the baby boomers. Those are people that are now in their 60s and 70s that were born in the aftermath of World War II, when all of the soldiers came back and wanted to have families, and and what also happened was a dramatic increase in the recreation at national parks. So in 1940, there were 16 million people visiting national parks. In 1950, 33 million. And by 1960, 79 million. So national parks were becoming a very important part of the American landscape and the American tourism industry. At the same time, of course, there was the increase in the use of cars and highways. In the 1950s, President Eisenhower did the Federal Highway Act that laid most of the highways that we know today that go through different regions, and that all, was a result of economic changes. Now, of course, I think today that there's a lot more emphasis on alternatives to automobiles, although, of course, still the emphasis is on cars. But this is sort of just showing some of the changes that occurred over time in terms of the number of people that were touched by national parks. And again, in 1960, there were probably about 200 million U.S. citizens, so that 79 million people visited, that actually is almost half of the U.S. population at the time. So there were also a lot of science and awareness that were going on at this time. Some popular books were Leopold's Sand Country Almanac, Paul Ehrlich's Population Bomb that dealt with the problem that is Malthusian. The idea that whereas population grows exponentially, the land for and food reserves go only linearly, and that results in possible starvation. But another famous thing was the Rachel Carson's Silent Spring in 1962. And Silent Spring was a book that was about a chemical called DDT. Here is Rachel Carson, who wrote the book. And the idea was this, is that there was a pesticide that was used very commonly that killed mosquitoes that was called DDT. And it was a really good pesticide for getting rid of DDT. And, getting rid of mosquitoes is very important in certain areas. Have you ever heard of malaria? I mean, that's an illness that you can get that's mosquito-borne. And even these days, you've heard of Zika, which is a more recent illness that's causing birth defects in children in more tropical regions, so places in the lower south, Puerto Rico, and other countries that are in the Central America. So there is a need to not have mosquitoes in your environment, but the problem is that the same chemical DDT would accumulate in birds, and so birds were dying in enormous numbers. The bald eagle was very much threatened, and there was a time where there were only several thousand bald eagles left. And again, for the symbol of America to have it go extinct was a kind of a shocking thing. And the problem here was what I'll show in the next slide is bioaccumulation. Is that DDT in water, although it's a very small amount in water, 0.00003 part per million, so a very small amount, but plankton would absorb this DDT. And so over the course of time, the plankton would eat the DDT, and it would increase in concentration to 0.04 parts per million. And then fish would eat the plankton. And so again, they ate so much plankton that it then became, in small fish, 0.5 parts per million, and then in large fish, 2 parts per million, and then in the birds that ate the fish, 25 parts per million. And so over the course of time, the concentration of DDT increased about 10 million times, which again is it had an effect on the ability of eggs to thrive. And so Rachel Carson wrote this book, and they banned DDT. And now, there are bald eagles that are throughout the pine barrens in New Jersey. Bald eagles are not a rare sight anymore. Whereas they once were something that you almost would have to go to Alaska to see. So ultimately, there's polarization that's occurred over the course of the last, say, 50 years. Um, because there are those that are supporters of industry, and there's those that are supportive of the environment, who are worried about the effects of pollution. And you find that there's a political dimension to this too. It's often, you know, those that are on the liberal side of the political spectrum to be worried about the environment, and those that are on the more conservative end to be worried about industry. Now, of course, there's reason to worry about both. You don't want to have a failing economy, but also you don't want to have a polluted environment. So balancing the interests of industry with the interests of the environment seemed to be a really important goal that just has proven really tough to do. So what occurred in the 1960s were the rise of some national green organizations that are national but non-governmental. So one of the most famous of which is the World Wildlife Fund, which you've seen that picture before and advertising in different places, and also the Environmental Defense Fund. These are both lobbying organizations that try to work with politicians to get them to see the importance of engaging in environmental actions that are sustainable. But there also were some catalysts that changed public opinion. So in 1969 in Cincinnati, the Cuyahoga River, because of a chemical spill, was set on fire. So imagine that, to walk to the Delaware River. Well, again, this is an online course, so I don't know where any of you are right now, but if I'm on campus and I walk to the Delaware River, it's only about a 5-minute walk. But if I got there and the whole thing was on fire, I'd be pretty shocked, and because you don't normally see waterways on fire. There was another oil spill in Santa Barbara. If you've ever been to Santa Barbara, they really appreciate their beaches, and they love their fishing and the wildlife out there. And so it was pretty horrifying to the people of Santa Barbara to find that their shores were covered in slick oil, and their beloved seabirds and other wildlife were also equally affected. And that changed people's perspective away from industry and more towards environmentalism. So the federal government responded in the 1960s under administrations that were more democratic, with the Clean Air Act in '63, the Water Quality Act in '65, the Endangered Species Conservation Act in '66, and the National Wild and Scenic Rivers Act in '68. I do want to mention that these things preceded the two examples that I gave, with the river on fire and Santa Barbara, but there were other things that were going on that led up to this that were concerning. So this was not like, these effects didn't precede the cause. There were other causes. It's just the other ones were more significant in, really getting people to want to change things. And one of the other important acts was in 1969, the National Environment Policy Act, which basically mandated that the federal government, before doing any project, would do an environmental impact study to show that whatever it is that they're building, whether it be a bridge or a highway or a military base, to assess whether or not there are environmental impacts of developing these structures. Because, in any given time that you're building something, you're affecting wildlife and you're affecting, migration of species. And so they had this policy act in order to make sure that no federal projects would be negatively impacting wildlife. And then there's the National Environmental Policy Act, which was amended in 1969 and signed into law by President Nixon. Nixon played a really important role in protecting the environment because, again, honestly, it's not a political thing. The environment is not political, even though it often falls along those lines. But, in reality, I would argue that preserving the environment is very much a conservative policy. The only problem is that it contradicts the conservative, or at least the Republican conservative value on industry. So this, again, is where industry and environment are often at contrary needs. But Nixon was actually very good on the environment because he did enact the EPA, the Environment Protection Agency. So there were a lot of issues in the 60s and 70s. Population growth, fossil fuel drilling, water pollution, nuclear weapons testing. The United States tested over 1,000, set off over 1,000 atmospheric nuclear tests where radiation was released. Most of this in either the remote areas of the Pacific, but also in western United States. Recycling became an important issue in the late 60s and early 70s. The protection of wilderness, the role of nuclear power. Nuclear power, of course, is a very clean energy if you don't spill the nuclear material. And there have been many, many more than actually one might even know publicly, nuclear spills, starting in the United States with, there were a couple in the 1950s, but most famously was probably 3 Mile Island, which was in Pennsylvania, near here, and where radioactive xenon was released into the atmosphere. But of course, there was the major events that occurred at Chernobyl in 1986, and then more recently in Fukushima in 2011 when the tsunami hit, and the power plant there released tons of radioactive material. Given the number of nuclear power plants there will be disasters. That's one thing that you can never get industry to be so safe that it is completely unlikely that an accident will occur. It's just that these are ticking time bombs that are waiting to happen. Air pollution became an issue, and also landfilling waste. In the 70s and 80s, there was a huge issue on landfills but it was the 1970s that were known as the environmental decade. The federal government responds to all of these things with the National Environment Policy Act, which I just mentioned, and in 1970, the creation of the EPA by Nixon. The Clean Air Act was amended, the Endangered Species Act in 1973, and in 77, the Clean Water Act. And in reality, these changes really did make a difference. If you look at pictures from years ago in cities like New York and Los Angeles, they're just completely enshrouded in smog. But today, because of regulations that the EPA have mandated on cars and factory emissions, there really has been a improvement in the quality of air, which really makes it a lot more comfortable to live in environments. There was Earth Day in 1970. I'll get to the pictures in a second, but here's an example of rivers and streams in Illinois in 1972 and 2002. And you can see that the green means fair. And just notice how much of it is green in 1972 versus blue for good in 2002. So these policies did make a change. Here's a picture of, I believe, Los Angeles in 1968 and 2005. There's a big difference in the air quality than in these two cities. Another thing that was changed is that you've often probably in your lifetime seen unleaded gas. You probably never have seen leaded gas because leaded gas was used in old kinds of engines, but they used to add lead to gasoline. And, lead is a horrible toxin. And so, people would be idling their cars at a parking lot near a playground. And all of this lead was going into the air and being ingested by children. Had some severely negative impacts on their health. Here is another Los Angeles before the EPA back in the 1960s, or that's actually 1948. And here is after the EPA. This is today. You can see that there's a big difference. Now, I can't say that these photos aren't somewhat, how can you compare? Could that have just been a rainy day on the left and a clear day on the right? I don't know that for an answer, but the point is there's lots of these pictures around on the internet that you can find to show how different it was before and after the EPA. But then the empire strikes back. So business strikes back and industry responds to the new regulations by forming research groups, educational materials, public relations. They basically formed lobbyists that would lobby the government into not, furthering any legislation or restrictions. Most industry does not like regulation because regulation means more money. If I say to you, big factory, you need to put a scrubber in your tower, your smokestack, so that there's not acid rain produced. I have to buy the scrubber. That's expensive, and that otherwise I wouldn't have had to have done that. So industry really battles these, agencies in the courts. There are also shifting strategies. Broadening issues weakens the non-government organizations. So there was a lot of loss of specific focus, but also the rise of radical environmentalism, such as Greenpeace in '71, Sea Shepherd in '77, and Earth First in 1980. And these are organizations that do things that are a little bit more extreme, a little bit less mainstream. They will hijack boats and try to sink boats that are polluters. They will, climb cranes and put banners on, and they'll stay in the crane so the crane can't be operated. They do some things that are pretty radical, and one could admire them, or one could think that they are not doing society a favor, depending on what your position is. In the 1980s, with Ronald Reagan, there was a lot of deregulation. Reagan was not a fan of regulations, and Reagan was, a very conservative person. And his goal was to minimize federal regulations. He really did want to cut. And what he did is he developed a bunch of councils to try to sidestep the EPA. And, it was not a great decade for the environment in the 1980s. But there also kept on being environmental disasters. Every year there seemed to be another. So in '78 there was Love Canal, which is in New York, where an entire city had to be abandoned because the groundwater was polluted with a cancer-causing agent. There was the Atox one, which was a oil rig that spilled oil. 3 Mile Island in '79, which I just mentioned. That's where the xenon was released. Bhopal in India in '84, 3,000 people died because there was the release of a toxic gas called MIC. Don't ask me what that stands for right now. Methyl something cyanide, and it's a poison. And basically, because of the poor management of this factory by the company Union Carbide, 3,000 people, basically asphyxiated to death. There was Chernobyl, which was the nuclear disaster, and then in 1989, the Exxon Valdez, which was in Alaska, where a ship, basically piloted by a drunk guy, ran aground and spilled a ton of crude oil, into the waterway up there, and really damaged wildlife. And that really changed people's perspective about what we're doing. Something had to give. So in the '90s, there was an elevation of the consciousness of environmental issues. It became a more common theme that schools would teach in biology classes and other venues. There was the 1990 Earth Day, which was the anniversary Earth Day. It was a big celebration, and the Earth Summit. And there was also the strong environmental policy of the Clinton-Gore administration. Recall that Gore did that film, An Inconvenient Truth, about climate change. He was really big into protecting the environment, and he was kind of a strong vice president. So he played a really big role. And I know that some of you now are, we're too young to remember this, but in the year 2000, he almost was elected president. Other things that occurred were more global awareness. This is a famous image of the Earth called the Blue Marble image. It was taken from Apollo 17 mission to the moon. And it was one of these things where people could look back on and think that, this is our home. This is the Earth that we live on. And what are we doing to preserve it? It's a similar thing to what Carl Sagan did in what you watched in the first unit of this course, where you saw the pale blue dot. I think it's the same kind of idea to get at global awareness here. Now, in the 21st century, in the Bush administration, environmental issues were a low priority. Granted, he had 9/11 occur, and the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War. A lot was going on that the environment never really reached a sort of level of attention that you may have needed. However, Obama did place more emphasis on the environment. He signed the Paris Treaty, which was non-binding, but it was signed by all but 3 nations. And he prohibited the Keystone Pipeline project, which was a project that many people opposed because they were afraid that if the pipe broke, it would ruin an aquifer that supplies water to a large region of the country. And he also did a series of smaller yet important environmental policy changes. These were sort of micro changes, but they made a really big difference at local levels, like, for instance, requiring mining operations to be more environmentally safe, things like that. But now we're here with Trump. And as you know, Trump withdrew the U.S. from the Paris Treaty in a largely symbolic gesture. It didn't really do anything, but it was a symbolic gesture. And he actually is in the process of reversing most of the Obama-era environmental policy changes that can be done by executive decree. And in general, things just don't look great from an environmental perspective. I don't think that Trump is known to be a particular fan of environmental science or a reader of anything that's environmentally related. So at least there's been no discussion so far. And, I'm sure that you've been following the news to some extent. So much of the news is being sucked up by, criminal investigations and other allegations about Russia ties that it's really hard, I believe, for anything to get done at this point. But in general, things don't look great right now.